Just remind me when you were in Churchill,
Oh gosh.
just in case it comes up. I'm trying to
Yeah,
remember.
1978. I got there in
Right.
February of 78.
Oh, Jesus, what a time to arrive.
Yeah. Yeah. They had a goodbye party for me at the old Munich in Montreal before I left. I just turned 19. And somebody said to me, the capacity of the old Munich is bigger than the population of Churchill.
That's
It
probably
was,
the case.
yeah, it was really culture shock. And I was completely taken with your
Yeah.
descriptions early in the book. It put me right back there. It was that and the phrase from the book, stay 3 years and you'll never leave.
Yeah.
I used to hear that a lot.
Yeah. And it was so true, man. I
Yeah.
mean, I was right near the 3-year mark, and I really struggled. I thought, really, do I want to leave? I mean, this is so great here.
Well, you must look back on it with fondness, though, Peter.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, listen, I mean, Churchill made me, like it gave me my break.
Yeah.
I'd probably still be there loading bags.
Yeah. I like you had the only reason I got the job up there was because nobody would go up there. They were closing the station and they couldn't get, CBC said to me, can't guarantee you a gig after that, but if you want to go. And I thought, why not?
It's got to be the only station in Canada that's ever closed.
Yeah, that's true. Although give them a minute, the way things are going in the business, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. Hey, Peter, the book is just terrific. I absolutely loved it from start to finish. There was so much in it. There were so many great stories in it. I've been phoning all my friends and saying, you've got to read Peter's book. It's really, it's really terrific. Especially, I don't know if it's because I was in broadcasting, but it's just a terrific. You told just enough stories, and you didn't tell any stories out of school, so to speak. And I wondered how you chose them.
Well, what the easiest way to answer that question is, these are mainly stories that I'd end up telling, friends or family around, restaurant tables or dinner tables at home, when people would ask me about certain things. They're the kind of stories that never made it to air because you were dealing with real news, where in fact they're a lot more interesting than the real news ever was. And I could gauge, from the reactions of telling the stories, that people really enjoyed them. And then I started using a couple of them in speeches that I gave, and the crowd would go crazy. And so I thought, hey, there's a book here. And when they, I didn't want to do a biography, and they kept calling it a memoir, and I got really upset, saying I don't want to do a memoir, because it sounds like you're almost dead. I said, but I'll tell a collection of stories. And they thought, well, we don't know whether that'll work. And I said, and this was to Simon and Schuster, I said, look, I know it'll work because this is what I do when I give speeches. And this is the part people love the best of a speech. They don't care about all the other crap that you want to try and tell them in a speech, but they love these kind of stories. And I said, I don't think there has to be there doesn't have to be it doesn't have to go chronologically. You can just tell stories. And so that's what I ended up doing. And it seems to have, worked. It's, still on the bestseller list, and there's some pretty stiff competition in there right now. And so, it's all good. It's been fun.
Those, how did you decide what to leave out of the book?
Well, people said, why didn't you write the real CBC story? And I said, nobody wants to hear that. I said, I've read enough books from people who used to be at the CBC, who left, wrote their book about what various things about the corporation, and nobody cared. Nobody read it.
Yeah.
And, it just came off sounding like bitter and whiny. And I said, listen, I have concerns about the CBC, and I've always expressed them when I was there, and I'll continue to express them outside of the CBC. But that's not what I want to write a book about. I mean, there was a lot of good about the CBC, and there was a lot of good about journalism, a lot of good about broadcasting. And, that's what I want to share, those kind of stories. And, occasionally there are things in the book where it kind of raises questions about journalism and about the CBC. But for the most part, listen, I had 50 incredible years in that place. It took me around the world and around the country, and I'm not going to start crapping on them after I'd left. Especially when you consider how I started. So, really, I didn't want to do that kind of book. And I didn't want to do an overly personal book. They had to push me to write something about my, childhood, so people could have a sense of where I'd come from. But I wasn't going to go through all the different ups and downs on my personal life. I just said, that's not the book is about the business, not about me in particular, although, clearly some stuff about me comes through here too.
But it couldn't be a more Canadian book. I said to a buddy of mine the other night, I said, it's to me, it was like having dinner with you. When you sit with the book, every time I said some of the chapters are just 2 pages long, and it's kind of like having dinner with them, where the stories just keep coming. And I said, it doesn't get much more Canadian than this. It starts with a story of him as a child working for the National Film Board and closes out with Gord Downey. Like, it just doesn't get more Canadian than that.
That's right.
Really, really something.
And, I've got a relatively short attention span. and that's why I was I love doing 1.5 minute, 2 minute stories. So when I got around to writing this book, I was somewhat influenced by a recent book on Churchill that had like 112 chapters in it, because every chapter was, 2 pages long or 3 pages long. And I loved it. And they were, and was very anecdotal in a way. It was mainly about 1940, the Battle of Britain year. And and it was after I'd read that, I said to myself, this is how I could do my book. I could do my book with short stories, because most of these stories are short. You can't pad out some of these things. You've read them, so they are what they are, and it takes you 1.5 pages or 2 pages, or in some cases 3 pages at the most, to tell the story. And so it makes for a kind of easy breezy read. And it's also one of those books where you could pick it up and start halfway through, and it's not like you're going to miss anything. You can flip back and forth.
Yeah.
And because you don't need to know what happened just before to understand what's happening now when you're going through the book.
But it was like I guess because of my age, it was like a chronicle of my life. I mean, it really was. I mean, I thought, oh yeah, when I was reading the book, I thought, right, I forgot about that, and I forgot about this, and I remember watching him cover that, and I remember that's these guys and that story. It really did it cause you to reflect? I mean, we all, after we walk away from the microphone or camera, I think look back and reflect on your past. This was such a remarkable professional career and a story that you had. Did the book cause you to reflect on that?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, when I reflect on my career, I think about how lucky I was. I mean, the whole way it started and everything was kind of a fluke. I never intended to get into broadcasting or journalism. It just kind of happened. So, when I reflect, I think that, and then I think about how lucky I was to go to the places I went to. And, I traveled the world, I traveled the country, I met all kinds of people, famous people, not so famous people, and, saw, saw some things I wish I'd never seen, saw other things I feel richer for having seen. So, it was all, that's the major point of reflection that I have, is that I was incredibly fortunate, and I thank the CBC for giving me those opportunities. I thank the incredible people that I worked with, um, who kept me, kind of focused and on the straight and narrow. I talk in there about an old friend of mine, Jeffrey Simpson, who used to work at the Globe, but who gave me this little cutout one year, a little brick that I kept on my desk that said "Bullshit baffles brains." And I always thought he was absolutely thinking about me when he saw that. Because here was this kid who came out of nowhere and didn't have an education, and never been into a journalism school or any of that stuff, and it was suddenly had worked his way relatively quickly to one of the top jobs in Canadian journalism. Something was baffling somebody. I kept waiting for the CBC to say, "Hey, wait a minute, we were always really wrong about this guy." I was still thinking of that in my final year, thinking, am I going to make it to that final show? Or are they finally going to figure it out that this was all BS all along? Now, of course it wasn't. And, I worked awfully hard to get to where I got, but still, I never forgot where I started. I always remembered my roots.
And speaking of that, do you remember, you described those, those first few nights at CHFC, and I was wondering, do you remember, because when you start in the business, there's something that happens. You walk into a place, I remember the place well. It was all made of wood and the floors creaked, and oddly enough, had this huge music library, with older equipment, but there was a lot. I mean, when I walked in there, I remember thinking, this is like university for me. I can't believe how lucky I am. And I spent all my hours at the station. And I was wondering if you remember what it was, or what the time was where you sat down and you thought, oh yeah, this is what I want to do.
It was fairly quick after I started. Like as I said, it came out of nowhere. Like I never expected to be in this. And suddenly some guy says, you got a good voice and you should be in radio. And the next night I was on radio, which sounded crazy to me that could happen, but it happened. That first night I was in there. I mean, you came 10 years later, but I'm sure my fingernail marks were still on the board there somewhere, because I was so nervous. But as soon as I got started, and you talked a little bit between the music selections you had, and I loved it. I just thought, this is great. This is what I've always, I was made for this, just to sit here and talk. And like talk, I had to. I mean, I started the first phone-in show at CHFC in Churchill. It was funny because we finally convinced the manager, we can do this, and I'll do it. It'll be every morning from 8:30 to 9. And like the day before, he said, it's got to be on a delay. And we said, we don't have anything that can make it on a delay. I mean, that's the way they do it in the big shows down south. And one of the technician at CHFC said, I know how to do that. All we have to do is separate on the tape the record head from the playback head, which when you look at a machine, they were like a half an inch apart, right? But he said, if we string that tape when it comes out of the record head and string it around the room here before it comes back to the playback head, we can stretch that out 6-7 seconds. So that's what we did. We literally had the tape, the audio tape, stretched around the little control room there. And so that was the first problem. We get past that, then we sign on, and I'm saying, it's Peter Mansbridge, CHFC Fort Churchill. We're joining the big leagues. We're going to have our own open line show here, and we called it Words with Peter Mansbridge. And I gave the phone number out, and in those days, it was like the phone number for the station was like 3 numbers, right? It was not very complicated, but nobody called. Like I kept pleading for calls, and nobody called. Now, the place is small town, so like everybody knew everybody. So if you couldn't sort of go on the air anonymously, everybody'd figure out who you were. And so we started the show, and a half an hour later, nobody had called. And so the next day it went from being called Words with Peter Mansbridge to Words and Music with Peter Mansbridge. But eventually people got over their shyness, and we started getting a few phone calls. But that was all fun. That was all part of the thing that made it exciting. But to your question, it was shows like that and doing programming like that made me realize this is great. I like doing this. I'm not bad at it. I love talking, and I got over my nerves, which was only natural at the beginning. Although the very first night I did the National, it would have been about 1981. I was doing it on a weekend. I'm sure that people could see my heart pounding through my suit jacket. I was just like, I couldn't believe I was sitting in the anchor chair of the National. This kid had been, loading bags not that many years before. But nerves are always part of the thing. I don't know about you, but I feel good when I'm a little bit nervous before a show, because if I'm not taking it seriously.
Did you ever feel that sitting in front of a president or, a prime minister, maybe not a prime minister, but did you ever feel that in front of, worldwide leaders that,
never, I could tell most of them were nervous. They were really nervous.
Wow.
Because there was Peter Mansbridge in front of them. I'm kidding. Listen, there was always a degree of nervous energy for all of those interviews. And I wanted it. I wanted to know that it was there, because it made me understand that what I was doing was important, and it made me focused about what I was doing and focused about listening to the kind of answers I was getting.
But there's a couple of stories in the book like this. Your story about your brief but amazing encounter with President Obama, where he comes back in the room, and I think you had a moment where you thought, Jesus Christ, the President of the United States is calling asking me to come out and watch the chopper take off. I was glad to read that, because I've not had the kind of career you've had, but I've had those moments where, I'm looking across the desk thinking, Jesus Christ, how did I get here?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. I clearly thought that at the, with Obama, but I felt it, with the Dalai Lama, with, the Aga Khan, with Margaret Thatcher, in spite of the disaster that interview was. But, all these big names, and famous people, whether it was politics or religion or sports or entertainment. I mean, it was a thrill to meet these people. You realize most of the time that they were, it was the 10,000th interview they'd ever done. So you weren't getting anything original, and you were trying hard to kind of break them out of the message track that they had. But it was, nevertheless, it was special to be able to talk to these people and to be sitting in the same room with them and to actually occupy their time. I mean, I did think when I was sitting there with the President of the United States in the White House, and there are all these flunkies around him and security and all this other stuff, out of camera range, but very, very close, that here I was, this, kid from Canada with a questionable background, sitting in the White House with the most powerful person in the world, and I have his 100% attention. I'm thinking this is a world gone crazy. But it was only for whatever that turned out to be, 10, 12, 13 minutes. But nevertheless, it was a big moment. But the point I wanted to make, and I don't know about you, but as exciting as those kind of interviews were, the ones that are for me were the ones that had the greatest impact were with people who weren't known, who were generally unknown, but had been through some remarkable moment, some extraordinary moment.
Yeah.
And they were sitting with me to talk about that moment. And there's no spin. You're getting the real story, the real deal from these people. And most of them, I couldn't tell you their names now, but I can remember the moments. I can remember the stories. I can remember what they were talking about and why they were so engaging. And you come out of an interview like that and you go, wow, that was really something. I learned something I didn't know, or I met someone who was, so truly involved in the moment, that I feel better for it. And, those are the interviews to me over time were the most remarkable and the ones that I choose to remember most.
Part of it, I think, for me is the fact that I'm 63 and I got a little Italian blood in me. But there were 3 times in the book that you moved me to tears. One was the story about 9/11 and your daughter calling. It put such a huge lump in my throat. The other one, of course, was Gord Downey. I mean, I cried like a baby watching that interview, and when you recap that in the book, and there's the picture of the kiss, it was very, very powerful. But the other one that caught me by surprise, that I had to put the book down and wipe my eyes, was the story of the 3 women from Vancouver
Right.
after the tsunami. How did you stumble on these women? Was it through the little girl that you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we had no idea
Incredible story.
They were there. I mean, this was after the tsunami. We were originating the National from Sri Lanka, and we had correspondents in all the different countries around Southeast Asia that had been affected by the tsunami, and we were doing a 1-hour show every night for a week. And one of the areas that I was doing the links, those pieces to camera that go in between the items, was this one area near the water's edge. This is a little town on the east coast of Sri Lanka. And there were these kids that kind of joined to watch what we were doing, just like kids do anywhere, they come out of nowhere to watch TV crews do their thing, or at least they used to. But these kids were, and they were fascinated by what they were watching. And when it was all over and the crew was putting their equipment away, one of the kids had a soccer ball, and we were kicking it around in the rubble that had been caused by the tsunami. And there was a little girl there, and she, I'm guessing, but I'd say she was 8 or 9 years old. And she came up to me, and I was carrying a bag or had a jacket on or something that had a little Canada flag on it, like so many of us do when we travel overseas. We just have a little Canada pin. She saw that and she pointed at it and she said, "Canada, good." And she couldn't speak English, but she had this broken English. And the translator, who I asked to find out, like, why did she say that, said the word came back that all these kids had been taken to a kind of field hospital for shots, needles, to help them in the kind of dealing with the kind of things that you have to deal with after a natural disaster, like bad water and sewage and all that. And that the people who had given the needles were Canadians. And then we said, I don't think so. We know where all the Canadians are in Sri Lanka, and we have actually crews with them right now, and none of them are in this town. And this little girl and her friends were adamant that they were told the translator, no, these are Canadians, and we'll take you there. And so off we went trudging through the streets of this little town. It didn't take long, 10 or 15 minutes. And then we were at this field hospital. It's like a big tent set up, and there was a line of people, the elderly and young people, the two most vulnerable groups at a time like that, going through to get their shots. And there were 3 women there. And their story was quite something. They're Canadian. They were from Vancouver. And they'd been sitting in their respective homes in Vancouver when all this news came through about the tsunami and the problems in different parts of Southeast Asia. They got on the phone to each other and they said, we got to go help. There's something we can do. And so they took time off from work. Like, they took holidays and they used their own money. They flew to Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka. They got off the plane and they went through customs and they said, hey, we're 3 nurses from Canada. We'll go anywhere you want. We're here to help. And that's how they ended up in this little town. And that's how that little girl had found out they were Canadians. And it changed her life. I mean, like, in the sense that for the rest of her life, she'll always associate those 3 nurses with Canada and good. And you go, wow, I mean, that's a moment. And it sort of underlines why so many people outside of our country have such respect for Canadians. I know there are times that things go up and down for us in terms of the way we're perceived, and there are some for good reason about our treatment of certain groups within our country. But for the most part, most people around the world have this thing about Canada, about a great country, wide open country, great environment, wonderful people, and they help us. They care about us, and they can point to all these different examples of where Canadians have come to different parts of the world. Some with government, some with non-government organizations, and some simply as volunteers, like these 3 women were from Vancouver. And they have an impact on others that in effect has an impact on us, because it's the way we're seen as a country that cares. And as I said before, there are things we still have to deal with as a country, but there's a lot we can be proud of. And that was just, one little story. And anybody who travels the world and goes into, difficult situations, or in some cases not so difficult, they have stories about Canadians who've been there and have done something special to help. And that's part of the reason why we're envied, around the world.
Peter, I want to talk to you about the logistics of going to a place like that. There's a story in the book about you getting ready, or having to dash to Berlin when the wall came down. And and there's a lot of stories about airports and whatnot. And I don't want to spoil the book, but anybody who's traveled knows, there's the lineup to get to the door, and then there's the lineup at the counter, and then there's the lineup at security, and then we're going to be delayed for a half an hour. And I'm thinking to myself, Christ, when you're trying to get to one of the biggest stories in history, and you're plowing through the airports, I wondered how frustrating that could be. I mean, obviously, I'm sure your airplane miles got you to the best, the shortest line in the airport and such. But who puts together, when you have to go to, somebody wakes you up and says there's been a tsunami. I know there's people that put those logistics together, but how difficult was it to get to these places, and how frustrating was it to sit in an airport lounge knowing that Tom Brokaw was already on the wall?
When the wall started coming down, I was in Ottawa. We were doing, God forbid, a constitutional conference, November of '89. And I'm going, we're in the wrong place, man. We got to get out of here. And and so we convinced Toronto that, yeah, absolutely, we should do that. And so Mark Bulgich, another great ex-Montrealer, who was at that point the lineup editor of the National, he and I got on a plane and flew to Berlin. That was it, just the two of us. And yeah, I wish I could tell you some story about airport hassles on that trip, or basically any trip. I am a lucky guy. I mean, my start was lucky. The whole time I was in the job, I was lucky. Things always kind of broke my way. I mean, I did whatever it was, 35 Canada Day shows at noon on Canada Day. Not one of them was disturbed by weather.
Wow.
And there'd be mornings we got in there and the weather forecast was going to be, there was thunderstorms at noon. And I said, no, don't worry about it. This is going to happen. And it never did happen.
Wow.
Of course, the first year I was gone, it happened. But anyway, that was the same on that Berlin trip. We got there. It was all fairly quick. Brokaw had got there the day before, the 2 days before me. And thank God he did, because we had nothing. We had like no equipment. We had correspondents there. There were a couple of them who were working the news story of the day. But to anchor the program, you need, certain things have to happen. But we managed to piggyback on Brokaw's show because, they were on the air 3 hours before us. And as a result, they were long gone. And they said, absolutely, you can use our equipment, not our equipment, but our location. And so that's what we did for 2 or 3 nights there. And then we were off to Moscow on, a continuation of the story of the changes in Eastern Europe. But so that helped. But, logistics is clearly a big thing. But, we as much as the story always used to be, oh, the CBC is overstaffed and has too many people and spends too much money and blah, blah, blah. Maybe that's true, but it wasn't true in news. No. we operated on a shoestring, and while everybody else was flying around in private jets, when I mean everybody else, the Americans, we weren't. And if I could use my airplane points to bump up to business class, I did. Because it was as soon as you got there, you hit the road. I mean, then when I got to Berlin, it wasn't like you went to the hotel and relaxed for a day. It was from the airport straight to the Brandenburg Gate and sorting out a location problem, because we only had a few hours to go before the show was on the air. So that was the kind of but I loved it, and we all loved it. And it was not only fun, but it was exciting, because it was those kind of stories you were usually on the road for. Something big had happened somewhere, and you were going to be in the middle of it.
I know you were, lead dog at the National, but did you ever have to fight with anybody to say, listen, this is where we should be this week?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you did.
Oh, yeah, lots of times. But that's part of any good newsroom. You should have those discussions and debates, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you win them, sometimes you lose them. I remember when Diana was killed in that car crash in Paris, and it was a Saturday night. I was in Toronto. I was out for dinner after a round of golf with some friends. And, my pager went off, which is what we had in those days, because the cell phones were, remember those gigantic, enormous. Anyway, my pager went off and I called in. They said, Diana's been in this bad car crash and it could be really bad. And so off I went and was on the air like half hour later, and was on the air most of that night. And then it became, okay, we got to get there. We got to get to London. This story is going to be dynamite for a while. And the initial decision on the part of the CBC people who made these decisions was, no, you can't. We're not going to go. You can do it all from here. Well, let's just say that I was not willing to accept.
Right. A discussion ensued.
Yeah. And the next time I talked to them, I was already in London. So, and then we did, we did, I don't know how many nights, 6 or 7 nights before the funeral of incredible broadcasts. And the biggest audiences we'd had in years as a result of it. So, I mean, there is, but there were, as I said, there were arguments that I lost as well about being in certain places as a result of the news of the day. I mean, like 9/11 started with your buddy, Mark Kelly, was anchoring the show in the morning because it happened right in the middle of his watch. And then we went for, 44 hours or whatever. I came in and took over, and I kept going for, a couple of days, but at no time during that did we ever say, we got to go to New York. It was not that kind of story because things were happening by the minute. You couldn't afford the actual time to go to New York.
Right. You'd miss something.
Even if you got to New York, where were you going to do the show from? And what were the resources situation? And blah, 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 blah. It was a lot easier to stay in Toronto. But it's funny because it was never a discussion point, where usually on big stories, it was always one of the first things we discussed. We got to go. We got to be there.
I told you I wanted to talk about Christmas, and I want to get to that in a second. And I don't want to, I could talk to you all day, but I don't want to keep you. But I want to ask you your opinion on the state of journalism. This past week, I'm currently in BC, and there were a couple of ridings in the local election in Montreal, the mayoralty election, that I was curious about. I wanted to know how these certain ridings, I'm a political junkie, so there was a couple of people that I wanted to follow, and I thought, well, we'll watch the local coverage. No local coverage, NFL football. And I thought that's such an abdication of the responsibility of the license that the folks at CTV hold. And I got into this discussion with friends of mine about the state of journalism, and I, reading the book, all through the book, there's mention of Walter Cronkite, and there's a terrific picture. I marked it in the book. There's you, Alan Fotheringham, Richard Gwynn, Lloyd Robertson, Jeffrey Simpson, Morley Safer, Barbara Frum, Robert McNeil, Peter Jennings. I think those days are gone. Do you?
I want to be careful about this. I mean, there is a tendency for some of us old farts to talk about the golden days, Listen, I was there. They weren't that golden. there were a few days that were far from golden. But listen, there were some pretty damn good journalists who made a mark not only in their networks or papers, but on events. Part of the issue about today is you can multiply the number of news organizations and the number of journalists by 10, 20, 30 times. The landscape is crowded. And the demands on those journalists are quite incredible. Like I was a reporter for 20 years before I started anchoring. I can't imagine having the demands on me as a reporter that reporters face now. Servicing so many different platforms with no deadlines. The deadline is airtime, right? So you're working right up to the last minute. There's often not enough time to pause and reflect. You add all that along with the pressures that are on news organizations and networks and papers in terms of their own bottom line, and as a result, the cutting back on budgets, and it's not a pretty picture. I think that the biggest issue confronting journalism today is trust and truth. And when I say that, I come from a time where most people trusted the news sources they had in the old days, the kind of days you were referring to, because there were only a couple of newspapers and a couple of networks. And now there's lots of them, right? And some dubious ones. And the impact of social media and streaming services and the internet, and you can go on and on and on. And as a result, there's a lot of garbage out there. And the problem is, for a lot of consumers, they don't make the distinction as to where the garbage is coming from. And as a result, the trust in journalists has come down somewhat. It goes up and down, but over time it's come down, where your trusted news sources used to register in the kind of 70 to 80% level in terms of the trust people had in them. Now it's down around 50 to 60%, which is still considerably higher than politicians and various other professions. But we're journalists, right? They're supposed to believe us. We're supposed to be telling them the truth. And if only 50 or 60% believe what you're telling them, that's a really not a good place to be, and doesn't signal, a good future for our profession, unless we can do something to change that number. And I think we have to be seriously looking at the kind of changes that are needed, and starting with being much more transparent about what we do, how we make the decisions we make about what's news and what isn't, what leads a program, and what, doesn't even make the program, why we give certain people anonymity sources and others not. Like, how are these decisions made? Who makes them? Why are they made? I think we have to do a much better job at that, because the people we're losing in terms of believers in us are younger people. And I don't mean kids. I mean, the 20 to 40 set. Yeah. And if you lose them, boy, we're supposed to be one of the pillars of democracy. You lose that pillar, it's not a pretty picture of the direction that we could be heading, and some would argue we already are heading.
I always remember a friend of mine, we used to always argue about the CBC. He hated the fact that the CBC was publicly funded, and I, of course, defended it to the end, because I will be forever grateful to them for giving me my start. And one day I called him at home. It was election coverage, and we usually bet on elections. And I could hear your voice in the background. I said, aha. And he said, yeah, he said, when there's an election in this country, I have to have my Mansbridge tell me what's happening. That to me, that sort of, it was, I know you're very modest, but you were like our Cronkite. If there was a big story that, everybody thought, I need to see what Peter Mansbridge is going to tell me about this. And me in the business, I knew, you guys had the resources and the judgment and everything else, but there was always that, you turned it on and saw your face, and there was a comfort in that. For a generation, there was Knowlton, and for a generation before that, Walter Cronkite, whoever else. But that seems to have gotten lost in the mists of programmers trying to razzle dazzle people with, anchors here and anchors there, and 5 people at a desk. And I think the narrative's getting lost.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's a desperate struggle on the part of all news organizations and legitimate news organizations to try and determine what the landscape should be and what it is that consumers actually want from a news program or a newspaper or whatever. And they haven't landed on it yet. They haven't found what they think is needed. Now, I'm a traditionalist. I think there's been too much experimentation going on. Now, I mean, I recognize that it was going to take 4 people to fill my shoes. No, of course. I was never for that. I mean, I understood why they did it, but I don't think that that's what your public wants. They like to rally around one person on those kind of on your premier newscast. I mean, I can understand on local news. I don't understand it on a network nightly newscast, and that's why it's never worked. It's just never worked anywhere. But I think we were at a different time than we were in before.
Right.
And here's the example I use. And this is even after Cronkite. Let's pick like 1982. If you'd gone out on the street and stopped 10 people and said, who are the anchors of the 3 network newscasts in the United States? You'd probably get 7 or 8 of them at least who would be able to say, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings. They probably would have been able to say that. Now you go out today and ask the same question of 10 people on the street. How many do you think have the answers? Do you have the answer? Like, do you know?
Well, only because Mark and I have argued about this a lot when we get together after the second bottle of wine. But I do.
Oh, he's made it to a second bottle now, has he?
I'm a very big fan of, for example, Ian Hannamansing and, CTV stuck with Lisa LaFlamme and the one person, but that's because I'm a news junkie, like when there's an election, I want to see the panel. You know what I mean? I think there's, yes, I'm of a certain age. I'm not in that 20 to 40 group you talked about, but to me, if there are issues at issue, I want people to dissect that for me. That's why I'm there. I'm not there for razzle dazzle, and I'm not there for fireworks or technical stuff that they can now do. I want somebody that I know I'm comfortable with, who's going to tell me the truth, and I want to hear some intelligent people talk about the issues of the day. And I assume that most people that want news that way. I don't want my news from Twitter, and I don't want my news, today. This is just my personal opinion. I see people on television and hear them on radio in jobs that I know 10 years ago, they wouldn't have got those jobs, whether that's through budget cuts or, now there's no cameramen. The guys are carrying their own cameras. Like there's a whole sort of, it's driven by budgets. I get it. I've been in the business long enough to understand that. But I think there's the people that are making the decisions are getting distracted by that.
Well, let me pick up on a point you just made, because, and I mentioned this in the book, but I was giving a lecture at the Monk School at the University of Toronto to a bunch of graduate students. So, okay, these aren't 18-year-olds. They're like 22, 23, 24-year-olds. Bright people. There's about 100 of them in the room. And I wanted to do a little experimenting with them about what their trusted news sources were. And so I said, okay, let's break this down. I want to know, what's your most trusted news source? When you want to know something, where do you go? And so I started off. I said, okay, print. Like 2 or 3 hands went up. I said, radio. It was like 5 or 6 for radio. I said, television. Now remember, television was always, in my formative years, was always the most trusted news source. Might not have been the best news source, but it was the most trusted news source. 4 or 5 hands went up. So I was shocked. I said, social media, bang. Couldn't count them. There was like 50, 60 hands went up. And I said, well, what do you know about what you're reading on social media? I said, do you isolate on social media? I said, well, I said, first of all, social media, break it down for me. You know, Twitter, quite a few hands went up. Facebook, a lot of hands went up. And I said, okay, tell me about what you're reading on Facebook. Is it just like anything that comes on your feed? Or do you isolate, you know, it's a New York Times story, or it's a Globe story, or, you know, whatever. And most of them said they just sort of read what's there on the feed. So that's a big problem. That's a big problem for conventional news operations and news organizations who now find themselves trying to compete with Facebook as a news organization. And Facebook, of course, won't even admit it's a news organization, but that's what they're trying to do in conventional news sources. They're trying to make themselves more attractive to that group of people to try and get them, pull them away. That was one thing. And the other question I asked them was, give me one word description of what you think of journalism today. And there was no good in the answers I got.
Wow.
It was all bad. You know, they don't trust it. It's fake. It's biased. It's boring. It's all these things.
Wow.
And that's the group we got to work with.
Yeah.
We can't turn that group. The future looks bleak.
Yeah. Do you miss it? Do you miss the red light coming on?
Nowhere near as much as I thought I would.
Okay.
Thought I'd miss it a lot when I stopped in 2017. But that feeling was gone within a couple of weeks. I kind of enjoyed the being liberated. and now I'm doing like all kinds of things. You know, I do a daily podcast. I write books. You know, I give speeches. I teach a little bit at university. I travel a lot. And I do documentaries. I'm still doing
Fantastic.
some work for the CBC. So if anything, I've the retirement, I've been busy in retirement than I was at times before I was retired. But it's at least at a pace that I want.
Great.
To make. So, and that's the nice part of it.
And there's no pager that goes off, no 5 a.m. phone calls anymore, huh?
That's right. Yeah, it doesn't. I probably miss that more than I'm willing to admit. But overall, I had always said that I wouldn't do the National with a 7 in front of my age. And they weren't asking me to leave. If anything, it was the opposite. But there I was in the summer of 2017 at 69 years old, and I honored my promise to myself.
Is there anywhere that you haven't been that you'd like to go?
Antarctica. It's the only continent I haven't been to.
Wow. Okay.
And I was up in the Arctic again this summer for a couple of weeks because it's part of a documentary I'm doing for the CBC for early next year. But I haven't been to Antarctica, and I'd like to do that.
When I was reading the book, I was thinking about all the mementos and pictures you must have. You share a picture of your Diana salt and pepper shakers in the book.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite memento? Is there a picture that you glance at every once in a while and think, I love that? Is there anything that sticks out?
Well, yeah, I mean, aside from my children and my grandchildren, but in terms of work ones, I got lots of them. I had this habit of, picking up rocks from the ground of famous places I've been to. So, whether it was the Great Wall of China or the Berlin Wall or Normandy Beach or Vimy Ridge, and I have all of that. I have relics from the Franklin expedition.
Well,
I got, I've got stuff. Probably more stuff than than I should have.
And I initially said to you, I'm going to do this podcast of, separate podcasts about Christmas and to the Christmas show. And I wondered if you'd share a couple of stories about tradition in your house, what you did at Christmas. I mean, I know you got to a point in your career where I'm sure you could have said, I will be off starting this date and I will come back this date. So I'm guessing it was an important time to spend the holidays with family. And I was wondering what kind of traditions you had at Christmas.
Well, you're right. I did get to that position a long time ago where I didn't work Christmas Day. But I did, there were a couple of years that I rented a Santa suit and went into the newsroom and tossed little gifts around. But that was a tradition I didn't keep. I didn't keep going because I started when I realized that I didn't have to put a pillow in the suit. I thought, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. One thing I started, I guess about 10 years ago, I don't do it any longer, but I did it as kind of a lark one year. I did a thing called last minute Christmas shopping on Twitter. And it really took off. I mean, I would go to like crazy places like the Canadian Tire or Home Hardware, and I'd look for the most outrageous things that you could, buy your spouse or your kids or someone. And I do like 20 or 30 posts on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, which was always a great time to shop because there's nobody around. That was the one thing. There were no crowds. The bad thing was you had no choice. You had to get something. And that actually developed into quite a audience grabber, and people were pissed when I stopped doing it a couple of years ago. I still get stuff. I still get notes or tweets from people saying you better do it this year, but I won't be. No, listen, it's become, it's very much a family time for us as well, and to remind yourself of the good things in life and the fortunate things in life, and to recognize that you're also in the position to be able to do something to make others' lives happier.
Was it big when you were a kid, Christmas in the house?
There was a degree of excitement to it, but my parents, and especially my father, taught us not to expect, not to go overboard in expectation about what was going to happen on Christmas morning. And so I've long ago tried to make the rule in this house that I need nothing. I need nothing more. I have like enough stuff. And, when you're my age, you spend more time moving stuff out of the house than bringing new stuff in.
Yeah. Is there a traditional meal?
Well, turkey.
Yeah.
I mean, I love turkey.
Yeah.
And count on it. And we try to have family, outside of the immediate family and friends. over for Christmas dinner. So that's all good.
Last question. Has Christopher read the book yet? Your nephew?
If he has, he hasn't admitted to it yet.
I don't want to spoil the story.
I haven't talked to him about it.
It's such a great story.
I do remember warning his parents about a year ago that, hey, this book is going to come out and there's going to be a little story in there that was kind of funny, but it involves your son, my nephew. And anyway, so I don't know.
Okay.
Plus I still don't know whether, I mean, I'm not going to do the whole story, but I still don't know whether it's actually true or not. But whatever it was, it certainly worked to capture my attention and a former prime minister's attention at the same time.
Yeah, it's one of the many, many great stories in the book. Highly recommend it. It'll be under a lot of Christmas trees. Peter Mansbridge, Off the Record, and the podcast on Sirius XM, right, Peter?
It is Sirius XM every day, Monday to Friday at noon Eastern, and also up on on your favorite podcast platform. And that started. I mean, I don't know what your intention was when you started yours, but mine was basically a hobby for the 2019 election campaign, just something to do. And then I started it up again after COVID hit, and it took off. And the next thing I knew, there was this kind of bidding war between a couple of traditional news organizations, not including the CBC, I might add, to basically buy the distribution rights. And Sirius XM came in with a very attractive offer. So but it's still no different than it was at the beginning. I mean, I do it either out of my place here in Stratford. It's just in my little office with a little toy equipment that kind of rivals what we had up in Churchill.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a similar setup we have a little condo in Toronto because my wife and I both have a fair amount of business back and forth in Toronto, and also at our place in Scotland. So, but it's just me babbling away and having guests and the occasional a weekly panel with Chantal Hébert and Bruce Anderson, and it gets like we started our arrangement with Sirius in February of this year, and by the 1st of November we'd had more than 1.5 million downloads.
Oh,
which apparently is a lot of whatever a download means. I don't know.
Yeah, it is. A lot of people are taking you with them.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's the joy of this thing. That people have been sending me notes saying, we've been listening to you in the car. I've been listening to you when I bake. So that's the joy of the podcast. It's at their leisure, not
exactly
ours. Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm being nosy just before I let you go, because
Sure.
I know people will look at this because it's a beautiful office. Is that the old CNR logo behind you from a train car?
Yeah.
Oh,
it was on a station. It was like
Cool.
a station thing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that kind of stuff in this.
Yeah, that's very cool.
This
It's
little
not surprisingly very Canadian, Peter Mansbridge.
yes, we try.
Listen, I could talk to you all day. I didn't get to talk to you about flying and Twin Otters and watches and everything else, but I can't say enough about the book. Congratulations. I absolutely loved it. Merry Christmas to you and your family. And thank you. Your generosity with your time, considering all you've got on the go, is really remarkable, Peter. I so appreciate it. Thank you very, very much.
Terry, it's been a treat to have this conversation with you. I appreciate you saying nice things about the book. Looking forward to when yours comes out and you tell all the stories about Churchill and how much damage that I'd caused and how I'd ruined all kinds of reputations by the time you arrived in Churchill, and how hard it was for you to have to stumble through all of that. No, seriously, it's been great to talk to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat about the book.
Well, thanks again so very, very much, Peter.
Take care.
Okay, see you later.
Yep.
Bye-bye.